Okay, so my name is Chris Winter. I just want to thank Beyond Toxics and Lisa for the invitation to speak. It's great to see such a full room tonight. I'm a lawyer. I work for a group called the Crag Law Center. We're a public interest environmental law firm. What we do, in short, is to provide legal aid for the environment. And so we represent, for free or as close to free as possible, community groups and citizens from the North Slope of Alaska down to Northern California. So a regional group based in Portland, and we do a majority of our work in Oregon, and we've done a lot of work on forestry issues over the years, and including pesticides, more recently with Beyond Toxics and others. And so Lisa asked me to talk tonight about property rights and how property rights intersect with this problem of forestry pesticides. So I'm going to start, if we could actually get maybe the rest of the lights in the room up. I don't have any bulleted lists or bar charts, so I'm just going to talk to you guys tonight. But I'm going to start with this short story. I was exposed to pesticides as a pretty young kid. I was graduating from high school. It was my senior year, 1994, and senior day in high school back then, I don't know, maybe still here today, we're in Newport High School, involves the senior class camping out on the football field overnight and really celebrating the fact that they were, bringing their childhoods to a close and moving on. And so that's where we were. We were out on our football field in springtime celebrating for senior day. And what happens, we had all our tents out there, and 1994, we got sprayed with pesticides. And it wasn't a drift. They scheduled the football field to be sprayed on the same day that we were all out there celebrating senior day. Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh. I was born here in the Northwest, but went to high school in Pittsburgh. So this is kind of what I would call a duh or an aha. We look back on that now 20 years later because a lot of us have sat around and talked about these issues. Our collective awareness has been lifted up, and now all of a sudden we're like, duh, that would never happen. How could we ever let that happen? A group of high school students getting sprayed with pesticides. And I firmly believe that our system right now is broken, and we will look back on the way it is now in 10 years and be like, duh, I can't believe we let that happen. But we heard from Lori this morning about buffers, and what did she say? There are no buffers in place around schools and communities for the aerial application of herbicides. Today, still. So I got sprayed back in 1994 on my senior day on my football field, and we thought, duh, how could we ever let that happen? And in fact, our system right now would still allow that to happen under Oregon's laws because there are no buffers around schools and communities. So it could still happen today. And so I want to talk to you guys tonight about another, in my mind, duh or aha issue that we're dealing with in Oregon's, in my humble opinion, broken legal structure when it comes to pesticides. And we have on the books here in Oregon what's called the Right to Farm and Forest Act. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what it does. It affects your property rights. And when you think of property, most people think of their physical land. And that's your real property, the actual land. But that land is accompanied by a bundle of legal rights that goes along with that land. And those legal rights are actually your property. And those rights include the right to build a house on your land, the right to use and enjoy your land however you really want to, and the right to keep people off of your land. And so that's kind of the fundamental legal rights that we've all decided we need in order to function as a community. And why do we have those legal rights? There is what I call a moral foundation to those property rights. And the moral foundation is that we just think it's the right thing to do to be able to say, I want to live in a civilized place where I can keep someone off of my private property and feel safe in my home. So that's the moral foundation. But there's also an economic foundation, which kind of gets to what Ernie was talking about, which is we don't want people to be able to do something on their property and to push off the costs on their neighbor. And so we don't want someone to be able to say, well, I'm going to, construct something on my property or use my property in a way that makes someone else sick or that interferes with the way they use their property, because that's inefficient economically. So we want to force people to internalize the economic costs of their activities as opposed to being able to push them off on their neighbor. So we have a moral foundation and an economic foundation to our private property rights. And the way that you enforce those private property rights, trespass, nuisance, those kinds of things, you go to court and you sue somebody that comes on to your property and kills your livestock or runs their livestock over your crops and damages your crops. So you go to court and you get a judge to say, no, that person can't violate your property rights. And that's a very, very fundamental component of Oregon's legal system that's enshrined in our state constitution. And our state constitution, the remedies clause says, every individual will have a remedy for a violation of their fundamental private property rights. That's a constitutional guarantee as an Oregonian that our founding fathers wrote into our state constitution. Okay, so what does the Right to Farm and Forest Act say? It applies to farming and forestry operations on lands that are zoned for farm or forest land. And what it says is if you are on forest land and you're applying pesticides, and those pesticides get on somebody else's property, okay, except in narrow circumstances, the person that applies the pesticide is immune from civil liability for nuisance or trespass. Okay, immune from liability for nuisance or trespass. There are some exceptions. One exception is if they do harm to a commercial crop. So if they cause harm to a corporation that's growing crops or a commercial crop, that's an exception. If they cause death or serious bodily injury, okay, that's an exception as well. Or if they weren't reasonably imprudent. So if you can prove that they somehow screwed up in the way that they handled the pesticides, right? It wasn't an accident, or it was really, really bad, then that's an exception also. But in most cases, the person that uses the pesticide, if it's a forestry operation, is going to be immune if those pesticides get on your property, get into your drinking water, make your livestock sick, make your family, your kids sick, make your property less valuable. So that's what the Right to Farm and Forestry Act does. There's a big question, open question. How can our state constitution guarantee a remedy for every violation of every fundamental private property right? And at the same time, how can the legislature say, we're granting an immunity to people who use pesticides in forestry operations? There's an inherent tension there. That question has not yet been answered. It may be answered sometime soon. It may not, we don't know. But there's been a couple cases that have tested it. One case arose out of the Triangle Lake incident where a family down there was sprayed. And they tried to sue for nuisance and trespass. And they ran into this Right to Farm and Forest Act. And the defendant said, aha, we're immune from liability. And they said, okay, so what does that mean? And the defendant said, well, in addition to the immunity, there's a fee shifting provision. So if we take advantage of the immunity and we win the lawsuit, you, the person that got sprayed, actually has to pay our attorney's fees. So it takes someone who was victimized once because they got sprayed, and it victimizes them a second time for trying to defend their private property rights. And in fact, that fee shifting provision creates a huge cloud of uncertainty over everyone that gets sprayed. Is it subject to one of these exceptions, or is it not? To find out, you're on the hook for the defendant's attorney's fees if you lose. So what happens? Nobody sues to defend their private property rights because nobody wants to put their home, their retirement, their life savings on the line to defend their private property rights. So the uncertainty that's created by the fee shifting provision and by the law effectively disempowers rural communities who get sprayed. And that's happened all across the state. And we've talked to many, many people who have run into this problem. So in my mind, this is kind of one of the aha, duh things that we'll look back on in 10 years or 20 years. We don't have buffers around homes and communities and schools and streams and drinking water, and we've taken away people's private property rights and their ability to protect themselves, and we're penalizing the people that are actually trying to do the right thing and stand up for their private property rights. So to fix these things, we need to continue to have a conversation. It's great that Beyond Toxics is doing the work. That's the only way anything will ever change. And we need to support the legislators and our representatives who are interested in championing the rights of the people. And we need to continue to do that difficult but very, very important work. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. And at this time, I'd like to ask all, if you would stay up here, Chris, and ask the other speakers to come forward as well. And we will just try to get through at least a few of these questions. So I'm just going to throw them out there, and whoever would like to tackle them, please let me know. A couple of questions related to allowable limits on pesticide exposure. Who sets these allowable limits in general, and in particular for drinking water, and on what basis?
I think that's me.
Okay.
Those are set at the federal level, mostly by the Environmental Protection Agency. There are not hard limits for drinking water for every contaminant. Like I showed, there was a number of pesticides that are used in forestry as that's just an example. Only 3 of them have limits for drinking water. But then there's also, they don't have a limit for safe drinking water. There's also, like health benchmarks is what they're called, which don't have the force of law, but they're a recommendation. And then the aquatic life, benchmarks as well. So those are generally set by the EPA. For a few compounds, the EPA doesn't have something, and the U.S. Geological Survey has come up with something. Those are set by the Environmental Protection Agency for the most part. How they're set is, there's a formula, but basically the EPA looks at whatever scientific data and information is available on those compounds and on their toxicology, and then incorporates a margin of safety and uses that to set the safe levels. But those take a long time to change, so recent research wouldn't be included in those levels. They're subject to review periodically, but that's generally on the scale of a decade or more.
Okay. Then we've got several questions basically related to drift and aerial application, and asking if buffer zones are in place. How do those protect the public when from the reality of drift, and specifically drinking water supplies, homes, and schools?
I guess it's kind of a hard question to answer, because you have to, what's the size of the buffer, what are the weather conditions, what are the spray conditions, what's the applicator doing, what are they using, are they using something that helps prevent drift, what's the nozzle size they're using. So there's a lot of things that go into that. I can't go out and say this buffer size will do the job. But if it's wider, then the risk gets lower, but it's not as simple as that.
Okay.
And that's probably how I mentioned Washington. They did the research and changed the regulations, and their buffer widths are a range, and it depends on, like I mentioned, the height of the helicopter spraying, the size of the needle, the stand location, whether the trees grow fast or slow, and the wind conditions.
Has DEQ or anyone else looked at the cumulative effects of low-level pesticide exposure?
As far as DEQ goes, that's getting into what's the toxicology, and that's not our place. Our place is how do these things move in the environment, and what's their fate in the environment, and how do they get to where they're having either an ecosystem effect or a human health effect. And so as far as the toxicology, that's really more the federal agencies.
Yeah, it is possible to do that kind of an analysis and risk assessment, but because as we talked about, mixtures have there's different types of interactions in a mixture. The current methods to do that kind of assessment assume additivity. So the toxicity of the overall mixture is equal to the sum of the individual toxicities of the components in the mix. And there's some uncertainties there. It is probably pretty conservative, but those kinds of assessments are not common to do. I don't think we've done that in Oregon before, but it is.
Yeah,
it's
usually the sort of thing that's done at the federal level if it's done.
Yeah, we would rarely have enough data probably to do that kind of.
Is DEQ or anyone testing and monitoring the ocean near shore?
We do beach monitoring, but that's mainly for bacteria. I don't think we do oceanic monitoring. We have our monitoring manager here, though, so I'm going to totally wing this one to Brian.
We haven't done any. We did some estuary work in our toxics program. Open ocean monitoring was last done about 8 years ago, 9 years ago. We did some open ocean monitoring. Most of that's handled by NOAA and EPA.
So another question related to investigation and enforcement. How many cases are investigated annually? How many citations are issued? What's the compliance rate? How are the cases disposed of?
Is that an ODA question?
So ODA investigates about 500 cases a year. We have approximately a 20% violation rate. So about 80% of that's in compliance. You've got to take into account that there are thousands of applications made on a regular basis, so it's a pretty small number that we run into that's a problem.
Okay. Are there any studies regarding the morbidity of animals and insects that have lost their habitat and eaten sprayed foliage? Anybody know about that?
Probably.
Yeah, I think the
Well,
answer to that is yes.
there's been a lot of research on habitat loss, not necessarily habitat loss due to pesticide exposure. I mean, habitat loss is a really common mechanism for species to lose part of their range or become threatened or endangered. But as far as directly related to pesticides, I have no idea.
As we saw in one of the presentations, the Rockaway Beach watershed is now 82% logged. Does that stress this forest's ability to provide clean and safe water?
Well, let me think how I want to say this, but yeah, the watershed is a whole bunch of those tributary streams have no buffer at all, and sediment and soils can easily wash down through the area through erosion. These units are sprayed multiple times. We believe that these pesticides can also get washed down with that and yeah, I mean,
Well, a straightforward answer would be that removing the tree cover is very well shown to change the hydrologic cycle. It changes how, I think the fog interception was mentioned, it also changes how rainfall interception happens, it alters the risk of steep slopes sliding. I mean, it's, surface erosion becomes more likely. In the scientific research, yes, there is a large difference between a clear-cut site and a site that has a full forest of trees. And so, when you look at a whole watershed, it does change the water cycle. It does change how water moves and interacts with the soil and how it moves through the system. There's certainly a solid scientific basis for that.
Not a question here, I guess more a statement. Testing was done of Nye Beach on accumulations. Pesticide residue was found in crab, mollusks, and benthic communities. Okay, a question through public records. Could we have access to all complaints to park of illness caused by pesticides in Oregon over the last 10 years? Are those public records?
Those are public records. I don't know if they go back to 10 years. I don't remember what the retention cycle is, but anything that's in our possession is public record and you can have it.
Okay. And then questions about testing of Newport's water supply, when that happens, what the results are, and then again, who at the state level is making sure that the cities are following through with testing requirements.
So for the finished drinking water, it's us. It's our drinking water program. They ensure enforcement and make sure that testing's happening as often as it's meant to. And all of the data from that is available on their website. So you can go online and, of course, for pesticides, again, just people have said this before, but there's only 2,4-D atrazine and glyphosate are the only 3 herbicides in forestry that are actually mandated to be tested for in finished drinking water.
Most cities do not have the resources to do toxics monitoring on the untreated water. It's expensive. You know, we've done it in the drinking water protection program by request, as long as we have resources to do it. If cities ask us, we can test at the intake for a public water system. Most public water systems collect basic water quality data of their raw water, you know, pH, temperature, turbidity, but they don't have the resources for toxics monitoring. So that's one of the things we've done, is if a city asks and we have the resources in our program, we will do testing of their source water at the intake.
All right, we know that along the coast, a lot of people are served by private water systems. Does anybody have a good handle, a percentage, or total number of people served by private versus public systems?
Well, because they're private, it's hard to get really good numbers on that. Of course, you know, when we're regulating the public systems. And I don't have really good information on the coast specifically. But the way we think about it statewide is about 20% of the public, of people in the state, have a private drinking water source. But, you know, Oregon's a very rural state, so it really turns out to be about 80% of the land, you know, for where people live, are covered with wells or other sorts of private water supplies. But again, that's statewide.
Okay. Okay, the alder trees in the riparian zone along a creek are being removed to be replaced with conifers. The current plan includes herbicide treatment to control undergrowth so the new conifers can grow. This creek is used as a drinking water source. This is specifically for Josh. And then there's a 2-part question here. Is there any herbicide that is safe to use for this undergrowth control? And what options exist other than herbicide use to support the new tree growth?
Oh man, talk about a loaded question. So as far as herbicide safety, I'm going to totally defer to OHA on that. As far as other means, well, sure. I mean, there's a lot of ways to manage vegetation besides herbicides. You know, I heard goats. You can manage them with livestock. I've done that, although I'll mention that sheep are harder to handle than you would think for something, you know, that slow on the uptake. And then, you know, there's manual control methods as well. You know, getting out there with a brush hook or a machete or, you know, a brush hog, you know, if you want something motorized. There's ways to do it. You know, but the brush hog's not going to work around baby conifers. That is going to require hand tools if you don't use herbicides for the most part. You know, that's what I do on my property. Is I send the kids out with machetes and tell them to stay at least 20 or 30 feet away from each other.
But before you hand it over, though, even with herbicides, this isn't my thing, but there must be some ways to apply it that would minimize risk to getting into drinking water, regardless of which herbicide it is.
Yeah, you know, if you have more control with a backpack than you do with a helicopter, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You could apply herbicides, you know, on using a ground spray by hand, and it's more targeted if you know what you're doing. I think it's, you know, a licensed applicator is different than someone just sort of doing it on their own, which I think was borne out by the exposure data, how much of the exposures are happening at home.
Okay. I'm just going to maybe pull a couple of more questions. We haven't been able to get through them all, but a significant number of them. You know, a couple of questions related to acute versus chronic effects of exposure, and what kind of monitoring is done of that, and do acute effects necessarily lead to chronic effects?
So yeah, with our pest program, where we track pesticide-related illness, it's only taking into account acute exposures and acute effects. So the main reason for that is because a chronic effect is oftentimes you wouldn't know about it until years after the exposure happened, and it would be hard to even know, what exposure is even related to the health effect. What was the other part of the question?
Well, just, do acute effects necessarily lead to chronic effects as well?
Oh, no, it's totally possible to have an acute effect and not have that lead into a chronic effect. In fact, most of the time, an acute effect does not become chronic.
And can anybody answer how many gallons of herbicides have been sprayed in Lincoln County in the past year? Okay. One final question. If there is increased sentiment because buffers are ineffective, can we assume that tributaries are also contaminated?
Is the question referring to tributaries that are unbuffered?
Yeah, I believe
okay.
so. That's the way
It depends on the spray practice. I mean, if it's sprayed over the tributary that has no buffer, then yes, I mean, by definition, it has introduced herbicide into the water. And then, again, if it is buffered, then that's a different story, and it's, a probability game at that point.
All right, at this point, I'd like to invite Lisa to come forward for some closing thank yous, but I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank our speakers for a series of great presentations. Thank you all for great questions. And Lisa, any closing remarks to send us home?
Let's have a round of applause for our moderator, Commissioner Hall. Thank you all for staying late. I really appreciate it. I know our speakers do as well. I'm sure there will be out a little bit while we put the room back, and if anyone wants to exercise their muscles and help us put chairs and tables back, we love it. Beyond Toxics has a table over there by the library desk where you can sign up to get more information and or become a member. And if you would like to hold one of these town hall meetings in your neck of the woods, if you've come from far away, please get in contact with us and we will prevail upon the experts in our state to come again together to share information with the public. Also, of course, we always urge you to express your desires, your knowledge, your hope and visions to your state and local elected officials. That's what democracy is all about. Thank you for coming.